Welcome everyone who are here at webinar number 168 since the Andean Health Organization agreement, Hipólito Unanue, started the webinar series in May 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic teaches us that the capacities built and strengthened over the past 3 years should not go back. Research, epidemiological and genomic surveillance, the development of vaccines and drugs, the deployment of prevention measures, and good communication are essential for a society of care. Reflections on these and other relevant priorities to health and well-being can be found in the monthly NotiSalud Andinas newsletter, and it is available on the Andean Health Organization's website. We invite you to give us your name, your organization, your country in the chat box of Facebook Live or YouTube Live. In the same space, you can ask your questions or you can send them by email to webinarorasconu@gmail.com. In this webinar, we will follow the usual dynamics. We will begin with the institutional greeting, followed by the presentations of our speakers, and then we will move on to the Q&A session. To access the certificate of attendance, as usual, in any of the Facebook Live or YouTube live chats, you will find a link. You must complete a short survey and then leave your data for the issuance of the certificate, which will be sent in the coming days to your emails. To begin this day, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Maria del Carmen Calle Davila, Executive Secretary of the Andean Health Organization, who will address the institutional welcome and greeting speech. Thank you so much, Berta. Well, the Andean Health Organization Hipólito Unanue Agreement was established by decision of the Ministers of Health of Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela in December 1971. On December 18, we celebrated 51 years of uninterrupted work with the vision of making significant progress in the effective exercise of the right to health of the population. Since May 2020, we have been holding webinars every week to promote continuous learning. I cordially welcome you to webinar number 168, which aims to celebrate World Climate Day. Since the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992 declared March 26 as the World Climate Day, we have many reasons to reflect on the great problems of the 21st century. We know that inequalities are not only social, but also social and environmental. Climate, ecosystems, and society are interconnected. This is confirmed by the recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. On the international agenda, the implications of the threat of climate change on health have become more prominent, as confirmed by the Lancet Countdown Report on Health and Climate Change for South America. With the title, Trust the Science. Therefore, At Orasconu, we welcome the importance of the report that Stella Hartinger will be presenting to us today. Our challenge is to address the causes of health problems. Therefore, we call all of you to assume the reflection and conceptual framework of social and environmental justice. And Dorothea will talk about that. We urgently need profound changes. The transition to a society that cares for life and an economic system that values nature. A better future begins with the decisions we make today, which is why Jessica Bigley will introduce us to an important international initiative of civil society organizations. Welcome, Stella, Anne, and Jessica. This webinar reminds us that we need to keep on working for One Health to make Sustainable Development Goal 3 a reality, ensure healthy lives, and promote well-being for all, at all ages. Much health for all. Welcome. Thank you very much, Dr. Mari Carmen. After the greetings of our Executive Secretary, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Berta Luz Pineda Restrepo, and I'm a sociologist, and I'm a coordinator of climate change and social inequalities at the Andean Health Organization. And today I'm delighted to be the moderator of this webinar. After this preamble, we would like to cordially give the floor to Dr. Stella Hartinger. Stella is the director of the Lancet Countdown Health and Climate Change in South America and co-director of the Latin American Center of Excellence in Climate Change and Health, and of the Integrated Development, Health and Environment Unit of the School of Public Health at Cayetano Heredia University in Lima, Peru. Her current experience in research studies combines community health projects in Andean populations, randomized control trials, follow-up of large cohorts, statistical data analysis of large series, and the coordination of several environmental impact assessment studies, baseline studies, and animal and human health studies in different regions of the country and of Latin America as well. Her main interests are making health interventions that address environmental health problems, creating supportive environments for disease prevention, and maintaining health and well-being. Currently, she focused on childhood-related diseases such as pneumonia, diarrhea, malnutrition, and early childhood development, the assessment of environmental factors that potentially address both environmental health and environmental human health. Go ahead, Stella. Thank you very much, Bertha. I think that I will reduce my bio for next time. It's too long. Thank you very much for having me here and for allowing me to talk about the Lancet Countdown report for South America regarding health and climate change. This is the first report that we launched for the region. It's the 7th one worldwide. It was launched last year. But well, thank you very much for giving me the space to talk about our findings today. So now let's start. We're here because we all know that climate change is a threat for the health of populations in South America and throughout the world. Over the past years, we have seen growing evidence regarding the intersection between health and climate change. However, what has been happening is that most of those studies were coming from high-income countries, and that was also making it difficult to apply and to generalize data in other regions of the world, specifically for us in South America. And I think that that is one of the big problems that we have to face, is that we have gaps of information. Our databases are missing or are limited, or we have no access to them, and that makes it difficult to act and to make informed decisions regarding adaptation and mitigation plans that could work for our countries, cities, and populations. Currently, in South America specifically, there is an urgent need to analyze and to produce research that would address our main problems, and how is it that we have to face climate change. But taking into account all of this, the Lancet countdown globally has created centers of different regions of the world. And one of them is the Lancet countdown for South America. And our purpose is actually to monitor the impact of climate change on the well being of people and how through our indicators we can know if we are progressing or if we are going to the wrong side, and if the national responses that should be implemented are happening and if they are happening appropriately for this to work. This is the first time in which our findings will be published in the journal, The Lancet Regional Health Americas, and of course we're doing it in the framework of the International Climate Day. And just to tell you that Lancet Countdown South America is an independent and multidisciplinary cooperation that pulls together 21 academic institutions and agencies of the UN and of the region. We have 28 researchers of different disciplines, and it is the only way to be able to address climate change because we really need to work cross-cuttingly with multiple disciplines. Otherwise, it is impossible to address each one of these issues. What is nice of this report is that most of our co-authors come from countries in the region, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Costa Rica, Uruguay, the US, amongst others, and the results and findings that I will present today on behalf of all of them represent the consensus of all of our experts. So, just as with the Global Lancet, we work in the 5 fields and we call them work groups. So, the first working group, the purple one in the middle, talks about the impacts of the vulnerability of human beings facing climate change. The second domain are the resilience and adaptation plans for health. And the third one are the mitigation plans and how they are going to have co-benefits on health. And finally, we have the context or the domain of economy and finances and the political context at the public level, which is going to facilitate things to face and tackle climate change. We have 25 indicators and we are going to summarize them today. Well, not all of them, but there are 4 key messages launched by this report. This report, well, this is the first key message that we know. What we know is that without a doubt, climate change is damaging the health of South Americans, and the time has come to take immediate measures to take action. We know that the adverse impacts to health are being accelerated and they disproportionately affect the most vulnerable populations, as Dr. Kaye mentioned. We also know that the trend that we have seen over the past 10 years will only continue, and we have to take immediate action to face that. As you can see in this diagram, climate change and human health are interconnected in multiple ways, and we have 5 indicators measuring the impact and exposure to grasp some of these issues coming out of this figure. This section starts by examining several dimensions regarding heat waves that go from that go up to mortality. We have talked about certain indicators that talk about the infectious diseases such as dengue fever and also malnutrition. As we know, the exposure to extreme heat results in a variety of consequences for health, and that includes heat stress, and that is worse in people that already have other diseases like heart diseases or acute kidney disease or heart and respiratory diseases. In our region, an increase of temperature has been registered in all of the countries of South America, with anomalies that go from 1 to 2 degrees in several parts of Brazil, Colombia, Chile, and Argentina in 2021. The heat waves that are exceptionally intense and protracted have also started to be seen in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Peru. And what we also see in this indicator specifically is that the populations that are older than 65 and children who are younger than 1 are especially vulnerable to those effects, and they are increasingly exposed to these heat waves. In children under the age of 1, we have seen that they were exposed, so they had more exposure to climate change per year. And in the elderly citizens, we see that that number is around 12 million. So, of course, that will be translated into an increased mortality. Our mortality indicator related to heat has seen an increase in the number of deaths related to heat of 160% only in the period that goes from 2017 to 2021. Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Venezuela are the most affected countries and where this increase has been seen in mortality. Likewise, our indicator in section 4, economy, has calculated that the cost of mortality related to heat, and we've calculated that with what would happen if those deaths were to be prevented and the income that would be lost. We have calculated that almost half a million people are being lost in terms of their income. Now, regarding the forest fire indicator, which is also an extreme event related to heat, that is also against the physical well-being of people, and it can even cause death if they are exposed to the smoke or forest fires, or that could also worsen the lung diseases, respiratory chronic diseases when inhaling that smoke, and also the loss of assets that could have an impact on the person's health and mental well-being. 9 out of the 12 countries in the region has seen an increase in the threat of forest fires. Right now, our region has been experiencing 7 days more of exposure a year due to these fires. However, that is not homogeneous, and this is one of the characteristics of climate change. We are not all going to be exposed, or we are not all going to face it the same way. For the countries of Uruguay and Paraguay, they have seen an increase of 3 to 4 days of exposure a year, whereas Argentina, Chile, they are seeing an increase between 14 and 20 days of exposure per year. Climate change affects the transmission of vector transmitted diseases such as dengue fevers through an increase of temperature, rainfall, extreme meteorological events, and other phenomena of climatic variability like El Nino Southern Oscillation. South America is an ideal region for dengue fever. The variability that we're seeing now estimates the reproduction, and it pulls it together with the increase of temperatures and populational density. And what we have seen in the region is an increase for the dengue situations for the region, and that increase is of 35%. And we have seen that increase in all of the countries where the mosquito is present. And well, in Argentina and in Suriname, we have not seen that increase, but in the other 6 Amazonian countries, we have indeed seen that. Just 1 second, please. The other indicator that we have in the region is 2.3 that speaks of the vulnerability of mosquito-transmitted diseases. Our countries, and what this indicator is showing is that the countries of the southern cone where dengue is still an epidemic or emerging, is increasing. Argentina is one of the most urbanized countries in the world, and it has experienced dengue that is being seen again in regions like Cordoba, Santa Fe, and Buenos Aires, which are colder regions. And the increase of vulnerability is 7% in Buenos Aires. But good news is that in the most endemic countries, in spite of the fact that the vector unfortunately is disseminating to different altitudes, and now it's going higher, as we can see in Brazil and Peru, in most of these countries, the vulnerability is being decreased, and we have seen a reduction in countries like Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Guyana, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela, and Suriname, and that means that our healthcare systems could be working appropriately, and we have the right strategies to control dengue fever in our countries. Another one of our indicators has to do with food security and malnutrition. Changes in climate will also affect the nutritional content and the performance of our crops, and that increases the risk of food insecurity. In South America, agriculture is a key sector, and the follow-up of the changes and the crop performance is fundamental because it could have an impact on the social and economic indicators. And we have seen data from the FAO that 168 million South Americans that suffered from moderate and serious food insecurity. After the pandemic, we saw that that number increased in, and it's now 40 million people. Of course, it affects the most vulnerable populations, such as women or small children. This indicator tracks this association of temperature and the potential of the crop performance. What we have seen in this report shows us that this crop performance potential has been reduced for all of the crops that we followed up, which is different types of wheat, corn, soy, and rice. But we need more research to see what will happen with our own Andean crops. The second main message is that South American countries should increase their preparedness to be protected and to protect populations from the impacts of in health and climate crisis. We know that right now we need to understand, we need to assess and do a follow-up of the impacts to health of climate change and the benefits of climate actions that we need to have. And we need to develop our plans accordingly and taking health in mind in order to have utmost protection of our population. In this section, which has to do with adaptation and resilience plans, for health, we have 7 indicators, but I'm only going to talk about 2. But those 7 indicators are framed in the operational framework of WHO to build resilient, climate resilient health systems, to adapt the healthcare systems, enabling conditions and delivery of adaptation and implementation and vulnerability upon the mosquito transmitted diseases. That is what I mentioned before. One of our main indicators is the national evaluations of the impact of climate change, vulnerability, and adaptation plans. Since those are the impacts and risks facing climate change, since those are increasingly complex, they are more difficult to manage, and the level of risk will depend on vulnerability, exposure, and the level of socioeconomical development and our adaptation measures for every country. And that will expand to our health system. The information of this indicator comes from the WHO survey, in which what we saw was that up to 2021, Brazil was the only country that reported that they did a vulnerability assessment in terms of climate change. And in this survey, it says that they did inform about the development of new health policies. However, it did not influence the allocation of human resources or financial resources. And that takes us to have half of the effort made. Countries like Argentina and Peru have assessments that are being made at the moment. However, when we take a look at the regional documents, Argentina also did an assessment for climate change in 2019. Bolivia, Guyana, and Uruguay informed that they did not carry out an assessment, and we do not have data for Paraguay, Chile, Ecuador, and Venezuela, which did not participate in the survey. Just as the importance of having national plans to do this risk assessment at the country level, it is also important to do them at the city level, since each one of the cities will have to respond facing their own risk and vulnerability for climate change. What we saw is an indicator that comes out from the annual questionnaire for cities, and it evaluates the number of municipalities throughout the world who have carried out that assessment. For our region, we only have data of 205 municipalities of 10 countries that completed the survey. From them, 50% had a complete vulnerability assessment, 13% were ongoing, and 23% intended to do it in the next 2 years. Likewise, out of this survey, we have as a result the dangers that have been identified, which vary according to every city and country. For Brazil and Argentina, the main risks were rainfall, extreme rainfall and flooding. For Peru, water scarcity and extreme temperature. Chile, Colombia, forest fires. Colombia, Brazil included climate migration. Our third key message, South America must continue and accelerate their efforts towards net zero transition. Doing so will not only help the region meet their commitments in terms of the Paris Agreement, but it will also provide important health benefits thanks to the improvement in the air quality, the reduction of energy poverty, reduction of inequalities, excess, and to change our transportation methods and having more active lifestyles. And these activities are the mitigation measures that we could take facing climate change, and it tries to describe the co-benefits. We have 4 indicators. The one that works with clean energy to cook, premature mortality due to air contamination, healthy transportation and diets, and co-benefits. And I'm only going to talk about 2 indicators that I think that are extremely important for the region.
Como les mencioné, la región de Sudamérica es una de las
As
áreas.
I mentioned before, the region of South America is one of the most urbanized areas of the world. 80% of our population already lives in urban areas. And in spite of the fact that the countries in South America have environmental quality standards, none of them reaches the threshold that has been established by the WHO. Most of this pollution comes from the responsible sectors for the greenhouse gas emissions, transportation, agriculture, domestic, and industrial. Because of that, atmospheric contamination is responsible to millions of premature deaths a year. For us in the region, the exposure to PM 2.5 is causing almost 35,000 premature deaths a year, and out of them, almost 10,000 are attributed to transportation, 6,000 to the industry, and 5,000 to waste. The countries that have the highest mortality rate in the region, we can see Chile and Peru that have around 230 and 176 premature deaths per million a year. What we can also see is that the average income that is lost because of this premature death is in almost 3 million people. Chile and Peru once again register the highest losses, equivalent for Chile to 1.5% of their GDP and for Peru 0.83%. Peru, however, and Bolivia are the countries that have the worst atmospheric contamination right now in the region. Our indicator in terms of diets and co-benefits for health. The production of cattle and food for cattle are the main contributors for the greenhouse effect gases from agricultural fields. The consumption of beef for the region, it's 28%, the number of what is related to the premature deaths. And 23% of them, or 150,000 premature deaths, are attributed to processed meat, red meat, and dairy products, and that is equivalent to an increase of 28% starting from 2010. Argentina and Brazil are the countries that have the highest number of premature deaths that can be attributed to the consumption of red meat, processed meats, and dairy products. In Argentina, we can see that they have almost 26,000 deaths related to these diets, and in Brazil, we can see that it's 21,000. Our fourth message is that South American countries need financial commitments that are serious to respond to the challenges imposed by climate change. Implementing policies and adaptation measures for climate change for the health and well-being of populations is an investment that requires the support of the governments and transparent financial commitments, as well as budgets that can be concrete. And first of all, this has to come from our own governments before we start looking at international governments. We shouldn't only depend on international governments. This section examines the economic and financial implications of this transition to a world with less dependence on fossil fuels. The social expenditure, and that is a data that does not come from us, but I think that is extremely important to include it, the social expenditure in infrastructure that is necessary to comply with our climate objectives right now for South American countries goes between 7 and 19% of the GDP for 2030 in the region. We have indicators like this one, in which we can calculate the loss of revenue due to the reduction of the working capacity because of heat. What we can see here is that we have a very strong loss of revenues for the region, which is almost 7.7% of the GDP for Latin America. And if we see that, we can see that Venezuela had more loss, but Brazil and Venezuela were the most affected ones. The construction and agricultural sectors are the most affected ones because they are most exposed to heat. And to finish, we also have an indicator that addresses the net value of subsidies to fossil fuels and the carbon prices. Currently, the subsidies for fossil fuels can provide financial incentives that promote or hinder transitions towards renewable sources. The information of 2019 reveals that considering that all of the subsidies and carbon taxes, all of the countries that were seven only, they have negative net prices. That means that it is a net subsidy for fossil fuels. Venezuela, Argentina, and Bolivia give the highest net subsidies per unit of carbon, and those subsidies were equivalent to 10% of the expenditure of health in the region. For Venezuela, that number is 85%. For Ecuador, it's 29, for Bolivia, 23, and for Argentina, 15% of their total expenditure in health. Our last group of work regarding the public and political commitment with the dimensions of health for climate change, and that is essential to offer public policies that are focused on equity at a large scale and close the implementation gaps. Each one of these domains are key to achieve the social changes that we need to face climate change. And the support of all of the actors and sectors that are key is required. What we have seen is that the media coverage has been increasing. We have seen that the scientific community has also increased their scientific production related to climate change and health. However, there is a lot to be done. We still need to focus on the regional problems, such as what will happen when we have tropical areas, and we have to see the Amazon region as a carbon sink, and what will happen if the sea temperature raises even more, what will happen with our food security? And we need to see the indicators and to see how we're going to strengthen our health systems. We need to start thinking on climate migrants. What are going to be the impacts on mental health? And what are the adaptation plans that we will have for indigenous communities? Well, to finish, there is a lot of work to be done in the region. But we now know that climate change is damaging health and that countries should increase their preparedness to protect populations of the impacts of climate change. And we know that South America must continue and accelerate their efforts in order to have this net zero transition, and the countries of South America need serious financial commitments to respond to these challenges. We shouldn't just continue waiting to act. Thank you very much. And I think that I went over a couple of minutes. Sorry for that. Excellent, Stella. Congratulations. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Andean Health Organization, you have all of our support. This work of so many people and an effort of leadership on your part is essential. It is fundamental for the region, and we can see that climate change is damaging the health and the well-being of everybody, and the time has come to take immediate measures. We need to increase all of the efforts that are needed to protect the population from the health impacts of this climate crisis. We need to continue and accelerate all of the efforts towards a net zero transition, and we need financial commitments that are serious to respond to the challenges imposed by climate change, and evidence is fundamental. Thank you very much. Please, we kindly request you to stay in the room because we have received a lot of messages congratulating you and also questions and comments. And at the end of the other presentations, we will ask all of the questions together. And now we would like to greet Anne Dore Slovic. She is a collaborative supervisor of the Global Health and Sustainability Program at the School of Public Health of the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. She's a postdoctoral researcher in the Urban Health in Latin America project. She holds a master's degree in international affairs from the School of International Public Affairs, Columbia, the US, and a PhD in public health from the School of Public Health of Sao Paulo. Her research interests include climate change, urban health, mobility, and social justice. Particularly, she's interested in the interactions between research and public policies and how they can contribute to reducing the degradation of environmental health and improving the quality of life. Her studies include efforts of sustainable development focused on the air quality perceptions and contributions of social sciences in environmental health. And she's participated in projects of different sectors that are both nonprofit and private, as well as with income generating enterprises aimed at social, community, and environmental development in Brazil, the United States, and France. Please go ahead, Dr. Ann. Thank you so much, Bertha, for your introduction. And of course, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. Well, as you said, Bertha, I'm going to try to speak the best way as possible because of my mixtures between Portuguese, Spanish, and English. Hopefully, you'll be able to understand me. So if there's anything, please ask me via the chat box. And now I will begin my presentation. Just a moment. I don't know if you can see. Can you see my presentation now? Yes? Yes. Can you click on slideshow? Oh, yeah, yeah. Thank you. I will have to start again. Is it better now? Is it? Yes, it is. Thank you very much. I have the important task to talk about climate justice and to talk after Estela and this wonderful work that they've done in the region of South America. I really like to start my talks talking about stories, and here I would like to start telling you the story of one of my students, Bárbara da Silva Oliveira. That's her name. She's a student and she's majoring in public health. And she wanted to do a work on climate justice. She comes from a municipality that is located here, as you can see, that is called Mogi das Cruzes. And she was extremely impacted about the things that were going on in her town. So she came to me and she asked me if I wanted to work with her regarding environmental justice. And this is Barbara's area of study. So here we have a district or a neighborhood that is called Juyapebe, and here Vila Jundiaí in the city that's called Mogi das Cruzes in the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Here there is a river, and here there are green areas, right? So in 2011, that area was named environmental preservation area, and that area suffers from floodings. From this side of the rear, in Jundiapeba, there is a problem regarding informal constructions. And many of these people, because of the creation of this area of natural protection, they lost their lodging, their houses. But nothing happened to this side. This is a neighborhood that, as you can see, has a better structure. Pools, swimming pools in the houses, the streets as well, they are structured, they are paved. And when we look at the situation of the two neighborhoods, we realize that the side of Jundiapeba with the formal with the informal construction, here we have population that live on the minimum wage in Brazil, 68% of them. But when we take a look at the other side of the river, we see here a population that already has more income. So here, to one side of the river at Jundiapeba, most of them have only the minimum wage. They earn the minimum wage. But once we cross the river, once we cross the bridge, the social and economic condition of people increases. And that happens because of issues such as public lighting, pavement on the streets. So you can see that one benefit has more infrastructure than the other. Here, I would like to emphasize certain pictures. This is what is going on. So here, this is the side with the better social and economic conditions, and this is the side with the lowest social and economic conditions. And we can see that here as well with all of the waste. You can see the condition of the houses and the surroundings, the social conditions. Now, you might wonder, why do I talk about this story of this student of a small city next to a big city like Sao Paulo? Well, the truth is that just as Estella was saying, when we're talking about climate change, when we talk about the consequences of climate change, the people who experience them more, the most vulnerable are the locals that live under conditions of environmental degradation and they have socioeconomic problems. Those are people who have no voice in many cases to fight for their rights. So here it is important for me to talk about climate justice. That is a topic that I am really passionate about. In the Paris Agreement in 2015, climate justice and global equity became imperatives, and it was imperative to defend them when we think of climate change. So, when we think again in my student and in her neighborhood and what happens to her, when we speak of climate change, what are we doing? We're questioning the current instruments and their effectiveness in the reduction of inequalities, justice, and the demand of rights and future directives. What I mean is that what is happening in my neighborhood to one side of the river, why is it different? Why do I have more consequences when there is a flooding? And why nobody comes to pick up the waste in my neighborhood? Why is there no electricity or sanitation in my neighborhood? And also, when we talk about climate justice, we think about how we face the vulnerabilities, because the vulnerability has a multidimensional aspect, just as Stella mentioned when she talked about the report of South America. When we speak of multi-dimensions, we talk about territories with multiple pressures, and we are also speaking of the resilience and adaptation capacity. Another issue related to this when we talk about it is to question how applicable the adaptation strategy is when strengthening the particularities of every country. This is a question that is always asked. If something works in a country of the northern hemisphere, will it also work in a country in the south? Can we use the same adaptation strategy in a country where climate conditions are drier or more tropical, or sometimes in the same country we have very different conditions? So we have those questions there just to reflect on how we can understand climate justice. And now this leads me to a very important aspect, not only regarding governability, but also when we speak of the impacts of climate change in health, in our lives, in the territory. There is an issue that is extremely important. Who bears the brunt? Who has all of this burden and responsibilities. This is a figure that I extracted from the World Resource Institute that speaks of the higher emitters of greenhouse effect gases. It's important to mention here the gigantic contribution of China, the United States, India, European countries, Russia, Japan, Brazil, Indonesia, Iran, and Canada. But what happens? What about the people who work with climate justice? Do they say what happens in these countries here? We are the ones who must suffer the consequences, and that is not fair. Besides that, in the countries of the southern hemisphere, as I said before, the vulnerabilities are different. The scales, we have to think of that. We have to think about that different. And the accessibility to resources, to education, access to health, it's not the same as in other countries that have a better luck in the southern hemisphere. And here, of course, vulnerable groups are affected in a different way. So there are differences in the consequences of climate change in rich countries and in the countries that are middle income countries and poor countries. That is going to affect them differently. And in the same country, there are going to be groups that are going to be more affected than others. And climate change also has that specificity of exacerbating the social conditions of inequality. Now, let's go back to the point that Maria made.
Antes de empezar hoy la presentación de hoy,
We were talking about this before starting the presentation today. The UN, the General Assembly, made a decision with a very important resolution now, and they did that a few days ago. The UN adopted a resolution where they request the International Court of Justice to have a consultative meeting regarding the obligations of the states regarding climate change. And that is a very big step. Why? Because first of all, it is the first time in which we can really see the willingness to have a global governance. And also there is this issue of responsibility. If all of these countries here, those are the ones that are emitting the most, what are their responsibilities? This is a very small country suffering from the effects. And even if I'm not very clear about how they're going to enforce it and how they're going to regulate it, what I think that is extremely important of this resolution is the responsibility for polluters, and also the intervention of the International Court of Justice that will be able to point at the things that are being done and the things that are not being done. But of course, probably that will need a lot more support in order to have more regulations. So that is an important step, and also the acknowledgement of those who are responsible. Now, thinking of the Latin American context, what we see from 2017 and 2019, and using the Gini index, we see that from 2002 to 2019, we have experienced a reduction. That is to say, the living conditions, the poverty situation is not improving. Now, if we talk about poverty again, if we think of climate justice, here we have a map that was prepared by ECLAC, the Economic Mission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And what we see here as well with the Gini index and poverty is how poverty is installed. How can we have increasingly more precarious areas? So if we think of climate justice, what I was saying is the one who lives here, of course, will suffer from the consequences of environmental degradation in a very different way. But when we speak of climate justice, we should also think of risks and exposure. So we know that climate change increases environmental disasters and extreme weather events in terms of their frequency and intensity, and that will have an impact on ecosystems, infrastructure, services, the way we live. And well, I have just noticed that I let all of this in English, and the food security, water security, human mobility, and that is what the sixth IPCC panel said. But of course, that also involves that countries need to face up and they need to increase their capacity to adapt. And are the national adaptation plans addressing these inequalities? And I would like to remind you, how is it that we can deeply understand climate change from the point of view of risk and vulnerability? Why? Because vulnerability is linked to risk. It is a human natural phenomenon to have a change in the environment. The vulnerability is linked to an event, and normally that is a disaster which is going to affect the operation of a place, and it will generate the loss of life, and it will prevent the functioning of the essential activities in a society. When we talk about the equation of vulnerability and risk, we're talking about risk times vulnerability is equal to disaster. If the risk or vulnerability is zero, then the disaster is zero. But if one increases, then the intensity of the disaster will increase. So we're going to have more disasters, and many authors mentioned that disasters are not natural. If we think of the intervention of men in Brazil, I don't know if you knew, but we had a lot of problems of mining companies that did dams that broke and they flooded entire cities. A lot of people lost everything. And in addition to that, it is not only the capacity to react, but also your mental health and the trauma that they face. As I said before, the disasters imply loss of life and damage and the disorganized society, but they also entail expectations, frustrations when this happens. This graph is from the work that was done, and Estela showed it, but I put it here for a reason. I would like for you to think, when we go back to the issue of risks and vulnerability, when we think about this, it is essential to think what are the vulnerable areas. Here, when we talk about the heat waves and temperature, Stella talked about the consequences in children under the age of 1 and adults that are elderly citizens. But age is not the only factor that makes you vulnerable. We can think of something that people do not speak very often about, and that is that vulnerability is linked to race and racism. That is to say, my age is important, but my race is important as well. In Latin America, we like saying Brazil is a country that always says that there is no racism, but that is not the case. That is not true. What exists is a lack to have information regarding how to obtain those data. Well, we know that 134 million people in Latin America identify themselves as Afro-descendants, and they live in socioeconomic situations that are dramatic, that damage their health. And here, I also have some data from the Pan American Health Association, and it says that the rate of maternal mortality of Afro-descendant women triples the general maternal rate, and that is in Ecuador and in Brazil is 36% higher. And it was discovered as well that access to sanitation and potable water is limited. So here I am part of a network of researchers of urban health in Latin America that is called Sanurbal, and they have just released a report in order to make visible what was invisible and how to get data about race, racism, and health in Latin America. And this is extremely important because in Latin America is a region that even if we are doing things better now, we still suffer from the lack of data, and that limits us in terms of having important data such as related to racism in Latin America. Now, if we go back to vulnerability, we talk about ethnicity and race, but now I would like to talk about gender. If we think of the dimension of climate justice, we should also think of gender. And I would like to quote a study of a colleague regarding gender inequalities and women's empowerment. This empowerment of women in Latin America varies depending on the city, but the more gender inequality is associated with a higher rate of adolescent mothers. And of course, better policies or more empowerment of women could help us to have lower natality rates or birth rates amongst adolescents, because this could help in terms of social injustice. And here, once again, I would like to show you the percentage of youth aged 20 to 29 years who attained higher education by ethnicity. And what we can see is a difference between Afro-descendants and non-Afro-descendants. Now, going back to the graph regarding temperature and vulnerability, we have already seen that children, very young children, and the elderly people are the ones who suffer the most. But what we also see in this study of extreme temperature and vulnerability and the change and increase of temperature in 1 degree Celsius, we saw that elderly citizens with cardiorespiratory diseases are the most affected ones. But how do you change the relative risk of mortality? Well, it increases if there's an increase of 1 degree only. I invite you to read this article that was recently launched, and they talk about the aspects of climate change as well. Here I would like to talk about a more local work made by myself and my colleague from the University of Sao Paulo, because here we're talking about race, age, gender, but also there are other factors. Where do you live? What are your conditions, or the conditions around you, and the mobility? So here I show you some maps of the municipality of Sao Paulo. To the left, you have the Economic Development Index, the Human Development Index for the municipality of Sao Paulo. And where we have here in the red areas, we talk about the 10% lowest, and in blue, the highest 10%. That is to say, we can see that in the center of the city, the people who have higher purchasing power, they live here, the other ones live remotely. So when we put that together with accessibility, we have the same thing here. The people who live here in the center have a high index and better access with better conditions. So at the local level, in terms of climate change, when we think of contamination and when we talk about the transit of these people, because what we say here is that also at the local level, we have injustice. There's people who spend more time in transportation, people who are more exposed to air contamination, and they have less access to opportunities. Another work that I wanted to share with you, another paper that I wanted to share with you that I have just submitted, and hopefully I will be able to share that with you soon, is about how cities report disasters and the hazards related to climate change. So we look at 140 cities more or less, and different findings like biohazard, extreme temperature, flood, landslide, water scarcity, storms, wildfires, and storms. So we know that cities, they do know that this happens, so much so that in average, 3 hazards regarding to the climate were reported by city. The most important ones were the storm, water scarcity, extreme temperature, and wildfire. But what I wanted to know as well was thinking of issues linked to justice and inequality, whether there were certain social economical issues or issues of the built environment that has affected or that could help understand what is happening. Because besides the things that I have just mentioned, when we think of climate justice, we need to also think of these issues, the socioeconomic issues, and the surroundings. So we saw that the size of the city, the density of a city, the GDP, the green areas, they can be predictors of weather hazards. When we think of adaptation, the modeling, the mapping of hazards, and the expansion of green spaces is one of the options that are more widely used, but they rarely mention public health for a barrier for climate change. But we do know that there is an impact for health. We do know that we need to have interdimensional works to face what we will have to address locally in terms of climate change. And I would also like to emphasize another point that I think that is essential, and that is environmental migrations. The OHCHR related that the hazards related to the climate caused 25 million displacements in 140 countries. According to the World Bank, up to 2050, there is going to be 207 and 16 internal migrations and 17 million in South America. So we're increasingly going to have problems of extreme temperature, precariousness, and the use of the soil that makes it barren, like burning of forests in the Amazonian region. So we are going to increasingly see problems, and we have populist governments increasingly as well. This will happen more often. So I ask you to think that this is something that we need to incorporate more in the issues regarding climate justice. And of course, we cannot talk about climate justice if we do not think of the importance of active participation of the community and the construction of climate resilience. I am going to talk about the example of my student. She did this great work of environmental justice in her neighborhood, but that is just a first phase to think of this issue. We need to acknowledge the problem and how community articulation is essential to move forward on these issues. And of course, we cannot forget to address the issues regarding racial and indigenous justice. We need to define the condition of environmental migrants as well, because as we said before, that is going to be more common. And then finally, I would like to finish my presentation here with these two pictures. And here we have Mary Robinson. She said that climate justice is informed by science. It responds to science and acknowledges the need of an equitable administration of the resources of the world. So for us who work with this, it's really difficult for us to hear that it does not exist, because there are a lot of consequences in the poorest population, and we see that. And this picture here, well, I would like to talk about it because little ago, a lot of how the Yanomami are living in Brazil, the precarious conditions in which they live. And what does it say here? Only after the last tree is logged, the last river contaminated, the last fish has died, only then the man will notice that money cannot be eaten. So I invite you to work on this, because there are a lot of things that are being made, even if the situation is very serious. And I hope that you like this topic and that you will continue doing research on it. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this with you. Thank you very much, Anne, for your very interesting conference. This is the key message of questioning the current instruments, the injustices, inequalities that are multiple and diverse. You showed evidence of the connection between climate crisis and this big problem of inequalities and social injustice. At the Andean Health Organization, we have a committee for risk management and disasters and climate change that address these problems. And we also have the intersectoral Andean Roundtable against inequalities. And yesterday we submitted a report that is a result of the collective work of all of the members of the roundtable that works on the monitoring indicators and inequalities. And with your presentation, just reminded us that 30% of the world population with the highest incomes that we can identify as a consumer class worldwide generates practically 80% of the total greenhouse effect gases, and that inequality is seen in every sphere and also amongst the countries. It could be affirmed that climate change can especially be explained because of inequalities, and it urges us to do things. There are significant experiences, and there are many studies that without a doubt we encourage you to read and to check and understand that we only live in one planet. There is no planet B. It's fundamental to give a new meaning to cooperation, integration, the participation and engagement of every person, especially those that are most affected. That message is very interesting. We have to make visible what is invisible. Thank you very much. Please stay in the room because we have received a lot of comments and congratulations for your presentation and also questions. Now we would like to warmly give the floor to Jessica Bigley. She leads the policy work at the Global Climate and Health Alliance, including raising the profile of health in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations, assessing nationally determined contributions as key components of a healthy and sustainable recovery, working with national partners on local policy processes and research and analysis to support Global Climate and Health Alliance campaign requests on fossil fuel phase out and other issues. She has a background in public health and environmental determinants, and she has 10 years of experience in policies and programs. Jessica, welcome. You have the floor now.
Thank you so much to the organizers and thank you to the panelists for the wonderful presentations. And is someone able to help with sharing my slides in Spanish and I can follow them myself in English? Thank you so much. I will put the link in the chat in case.
Sí. Gracias. Ya vamos a compartir.
Thank you. We'll share them.
Thank you so much. So if we move to the next slide, to give a little background on the World Health Assembly and the resolution process. The World Health Assembly is a meeting that takes place every May. It has representatives from all 194 WHO member states, countries around the world. And a resolution is a negotiated document that tasks the World Health Organization and tasks governments with a list of actions. And we're very interested to have a future World Health Assembly resolution on health and climate change. And this is the initiative that I'll be speaking about today. We hope that the resolution will be adopted in May 2024. So next year we have a year to prepare. We've been working on some ideas for the resolution with a group of civil society organizations from around the world. This includes organizations of medical and nursing professionals. Some of them operate at national level, some of them operate at global level. In addition to those professional bodies, there are also lots of NGOs that we are working with. The work of the resolution would be taken forward by governments and by the World Health Organization. But together with these other organizations, we've been putting together some ideas of what kind of actions are needed in the resolution, what the rationale for the resolution is, and what we hope the conclusions will be, and then they will take those recommendations and move forward with them. So we hope to partner with them in the coming months. The next slide, please. To give some content on the global context for climate impacts and adaptation, and we've already heard lots about this from the previous panelists. But when we talk about climate change, we refer to it as, as a threat multiplier. Climate change usually does not introduce new threats or different threats, but it exacerbates the existing challenges that we're already seeing to health. And a useful statistic here is that 69.9%, so almost 70% of all deaths globally are caused by diseases that are exacerbated by climate change. So as we see climate change progressing, we are going to see 70% of diseases become even worse, become even more of a threat to human health. So not only does climate change threaten the health of populations, as Stella was explaining at the regional level for South America, it also affects healthcare infrastructure. And as has already been described a little today, the changing climate increases the threats of heat waves. We are expecting to have 83 million excess deaths, additional deaths due to climate-induced heat waves between 2020 and 2100, the year 2100. We're also going to be seeing increasing deaths from floods, from vector-borne disease, from waterborne disease, malnutrition, and injury and deaths from extreme weather events, and also mental health impacts, both in the aftermath of events, but also worrying about future events. In terms of healthcare infrastructure, we're thinking about impacts on the supply chain. Is it still possible to keep medicines cool? Is it possible to deliver medicines where they need to be? We're talking about the impacts of extreme weather events on hospital and clinics, on those buildings themselves, and the roads that give people access to them. So all of these things can be considered as healthcare infrastructure, and it's all at risk of climate change. But looking beyond the health sector, we need action in all sectors to address how climate change relates to health. In some senses, every sector is the health sector. So of course we need resilient health systems, but we also need resilient food systems to ensure that people have nutrition security, and we need resilient water supplies to ensure that people still have access to safe drinking water, even during and after a climate disaster. And we need resilient cities with resilient buildings and resilient workplaces to keep people at safe temperatures and to ensure that they are protected from extreme weather events. The next slide, please. So having talked about the impacts of climate change, I'll talk now about the health co-benefits of reducing emissions. This is called mitigation. It's about reducing the pace of climate change, but as we've already been hearing, it offers additional health co-benefits. So in the energy sector, if we reduce emissions by transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy, we are going to have better air quality. Fossil fuel related air pollution causes 3.6 million deaths annually. We could avoid those by transitioning to renewable energy. In the transport sector, transitioning from motorized private vehicles to public and active transport not only improves the air quality as in the energy sector, but it also decreases road traffic injuries. There are 1.3 million deaths every year from road traffic injuries, and it increases physical activity levels. And we know that not being sufficiently physically active causes 3.2 million deaths annually. If we look at the food and agriculture sector, transitioning to healthy, sustainable diets that are rich in plant-based foods and low in meat, especially red meat, and low in processed foods, and this will decrease the risk of diabetes and of cardiovascular disease and of cancer. At the moment, imbalanced diets cause 11.5 million deaths every year, and 17% of those, so 2 million, are associated with a high intake of red and processed meat and dairy products. And those contribute to 55% of global agriculture emissions. So you're seeing the wins for climate are in many cases also wins for health. And in the green, when we're thinking about city constructs and about green space, having green spaces with living plants, whether it's grass or trees, more green is better. This absorbs carbon from the air, but it also improves the air quality, and it promotes physical activity because it provides a space for recreational exercise. It improves mental health, and it protects us from heat. Heat is especially a problem in cities. They're hotter than their surroundings, and we call that the urban heat island effect. The next slide, please. There are some really good examples of action and progress at national level. Colombia and also Pakistan have been working with the World Health Organization to complete assessments that quantify the health co-benefits of climate action, but also the economic gains of that. And this is so important because it shows not only the health rationale, but also in many ways, money speaks. And if we can convey health impacts and health gains in financial terms, then it appeals to partners across sectors. In Bangladesh and in Nepal and in Thailand, the governments have prepared health national adaptation plans. Health is a really crucial sector for adaptation, and countries' governments recognize this. The health sector is identified by countries as one of the 3 most vulnerable sectors to climate change, alongside the water and sanitation sector and the food and agriculture sectors. And therefore, there need to be detailed plans to respond. So in addition to general adaptation plans, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Thailand also have dedicated health national adaptation plans. There is some really wonderful leadership as well from Cambodia, Cape Verde, and Moldova. They are integrating health into their nationally determined contributions, which are basically national plans to deliver the Paris Agreement that you'll have heard about from 2015, I think. So it's a good indicator, a nationally determined contribution of how countries are thinking about health. NDCs are their overarching plan, and if they're talking about health in those, then it shows that they are thinking systemically. Countries in the region of the Americas, in PAHO, as well as in the Maldives, have taken actions to establish climate smart health systems, which are both climate resilient but also environmentally sustainable. Of course, one of the most obvious links between health and climate change is how health systems are impacted, but we also need to be aware of how health facilities are contributing to climate change and to other environmental degradation. Health systems produce emissions, they produce chemicals, and all of that needs to be carefully considered. In the UK, the National Health Service was the first health system to embed net zero emissions into legislation. The UK National Health Service will be net zero by 2040, and it will cut 80% of its emissions by 2032, and maybe even by 2028. The next slide, please. To think a little bit about how this is being reflected at global level. So various World Health Assembly decisions and WHO work on climate change. WHO work does recognize climate change. There are documents on malaria and on nutrition and on air pollution that make reference to climate change, but there has been no focused resolution on climate and health since 2008. So already 15 years ago, and a lot has changed since 2008. We understand in more detail the threats of climate change to human health, but also the necessary actions and the opportunities. But it's really important that governments agree on actions that need to be taken at national level, and also actions that need to be taken by the World Health Organization. There's also some integration of health into the climate policy negotiations. So the UNFCCC COPs, you might have heard about COP27 that took place in Sharm el Sheikh, or COP26 that took place in Glasgow. And they are gradually incorporating more detail on health, but it's really not enough. We do see health mentioned in discussions around adaptation and in discussions on climate impacts. This is called loss and damage in the UNFCCC space, but we don't see discussions around the health co-benefits of fossil fuel phase out. On the positive side, there is recognition in UNFCCC documents now of the relevance of climate action to the right to health, but also most recently to the right to a healthy environment. So it's really important that health experts learn to engage in climate policy discussions as well as in health policy discussions to show those links. But all of this to say, we need an updated climate and health resolution at the World Health Assembly to be accelerating national and global action to protect people and also to protect the planet. If we move to the next slide, I can share some of the actions that are being proposed for the World Health Organization. We would love for the World Health Organization to support countries in quantifying the health impacts of climate change. We know that these are at very high scale, but it's hard to monitor them in places where there are limited resources. And being able to quantify the health impacts really builds the case for accelerated climate action. We are asking the World Health Organization to work with governments, countries, they're called member states in the World Health Organization context, to quantify the health co-benefits of climate action. For example, the lives saved and the costs that are saved as a result of better air quality. So quantifying the positives as well as the negatives, and making the benefits and returns on investment clear to hopefully accelerate climate action. We ask the World Health Organization to support member states to build health systems which are resilient to climate change and also sustainable, and also to support member states to understand the role of health in the UN climate negotiations, as I was mentioning earlier. We ask the World Health Organization to build on a One Health approach. The World Health Organization already works with the UN organizations for agriculture, for animal security, and for the UN Environment Programme. But we want to see thinking that brings together the health of people and the planet. We ask finally for the World Health Organization to report regularly on progress made in health and climate action. I said the last resolution was in 2008, and we really don't want climate change and health links to wait 15 years before they are discussed in depth again at the World Health Assembly. The threat is increasing much too fast, and we need regular updates and opportunities to share good practice and action. I move now to the next slide. Some of the actions that we are proposing for member states, so for national governments, are to develop climate and health strategies that include emissions reductions, but also include adaptation measures across sectors. So really thinking about what we can do to protect health in the face of climate change and how we can act on climate change in ways that are maximally beneficial for health. This will require coordination between government departments, not only the Health Ministry and the Climate or Environment Ministry, but also the Energy Ministry, the Transport Ministry, Agriculture, Water, Urban Planning. Again, all of these sectors are health and climate sectors. They all have emissions and they all need to reduce them, but they also have opportunities to protect health. It's really key that governments regulate fossil fuels to ensure that they are phased out and that this is done in a just way that protects vulnerable populations. We can think here about taxation and subsidies. Stella spoke a little about subsidies earlier. It's really important to maintain and improve energy access, but this doesn't have to be done with fossil fuels. And we know that fossil fuels have such a high true cost once we look at the climate impacts and the health impacts, and it makes no sense to be subsidizing them, to be making them cheaper when we could be subsidizing renewable energy instead. We can also think about other lessons from public health. We can think about regulating advertising to avoid greenwashing. We would like to prevent the influence of the fossil fuel industry and other carbon intensive industries like the vehicle or the aviation industries. and they have really strong vested interests, and we don't want to see these spill over into climate policy making. In tobacco control, for example, the industry is excluded from policy discussions, so they can't have an influence in the room. Again, we would like member states to be developing climate resilient and sustainable health systems. And more broadly, we'd like them to protect the rights of migrants and asylum seekers. We know that there is higher risk of forced migration due to water shortages or bad conditions for agriculture, and extreme events like floods and storms can cause communities to have to leave their place of living and to move elsewhere, often to an entirely new country. And we need to be building public awareness and strengthening education. The public needs to understand the links between health and climate change to be able to support ambitious climate policy making. Climate action is often not popular in the short term, but understanding the health benefits of climate action can help policymakers to make ambitious decisions. It's also necessary to educate health professionals so they can understand how to respond to increasing threats. And finally, it's so important to consult with civil society and with local and indigenous communities, especially the ones who are most impacted, as Anne was speaking about in particular. And many of these communities, as well as facing the most impact, have many of the best knowledge about the solutions that are needed. I move now to my final slide to think about the next steps. In the World Health Assembly preparations, we know that Kenya and Ghana are going to lead a lot of the process for this resolution. So over the next few months, they will consult with other governments and understand what needs to be included in the text, to understand what different priorities different countries have, because the context is different in every country. Excuse me. Member states can also propose that climate and health is discussed at regional meetings that take place between World Health Assemblies to ensure that regional priorities are reflected in the global document again. And civil society organizations like my own one and the organizations that we're working with, and many of you on this webinar can continue to reach out to contacts that you might have in government to build support and to say what you might want to ensure is included in this resolution. After all of this consultation phase, and the proposed resolution will be discussed in a preliminary way at the WHO Executive Board meeting that will take place in January 2024. And then the resolution will be adopted in May, and I'm sorry, this should say 2024, not 2023, at WHA 77. That is everything that I have to say, and I thank you so much for your time.
Muchas gracias, querida Jess. Excelente.
Thank you so much, Jess. Excellent presentation.
Que Milena Cergueda.
We would like to tell you that Milena Cergueda, who's an official partner of the Global Alliance for the Climate, she participates in the meetings of the Andean Health Committee, and she addresses the risk management, emergencies, and disasters. And she has presented this very important proposal of resolution. And at ORAS, we are committed to do the follow-up to the countries to see how we can keep on supporting this important proposal for a resolution to be presented in the World Health Assembly. This is a resolution that place emphasis on the need to update all of these problems regarding climate and health. It suggests actions for WHO, for example, quantifying impacts in health and working to quantify the co-benefits for health when we carry out actions that seek to mitigate and face climate change, amongst many other things as well. They suggest proposals for the countries, such as developing strategies that include the reduction of emissions in each one of the various sectors. Thank you very much.
Un llamado a qué podemos hacer cada uno,
Because you also appeal to us to do something. Sometimes we say we know what needs to be done, but who is actually doing it? Each one of us has a very important role to play to contribute to strengthen the relationship between the human beings and the nature, and to advocate to avoid these problems. We would like to say to each and every one of you who are listening to us right now that also in that commitment in terms of what we could do from the health sector, the Andean Health Organization with the Committee of Climate Change and Risk Management, amongst many other actions that are carried out to respond to the Andean Health Plan regarding climate change, we are working with the delegates of the committee and the key people of the ministries to measure the carbon footprint in healthcare centers so that the healthcare centers will contribute to the reduction. Therefore, through this collective work and with the systemization of the experience of these healthcare establishments that are resilient, you will find this publication and others in the website of the Andean Health Organization. And that goes hand in hand with everything that we can do from the healthcare sector to contribute to the reduction of the carbon footprint and also to solve the problem. Thank you very much. Excellent presentations. You were just in Argentina as well. Share with the audience what you did there. Yes, thank you very much. The Andean Health Organization is also present in the network that was generated in Latin America to face climate change, a network of multidisciplinary knowledge and also to advocate for public policies. There are various organizations that are contributing in this network, and there with a multidisciplinary perspective, which is fundamental, 13 proposals, 13 initiatives were submitted from the region for research projects. And the Inter-American Alliance and Global Alliance is working with other organizations, of course, contributing to the development of these initiatives. Just to give you an example, we submitted a proposal that highlights the index of multidimensional vulnerability, and it is a proposal to work on it in a local context in Loreto, Peru, with indigenous peoples and integrating the knowledge of the native peoples and the dialogues of this knowledge. That meeting was held in March 13 to 18 in Argentina, and ORAS also presented the work that they do in the management of projects. We all know how important it is to carry out regional projects, in this case, to face climate change and the management with the Green Fund for Climate, amongst many other organizations, and always with the cooperation and the work and the leadership of the delegates of the Ministers of Health, PAHO, and other organizations. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the excellent conferences. They have been well received by all of our participants. We have delegates, we have people who are connected from the ministries of health, the academia, from various entities and social organizations from Argentina, Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, the US, Spain, Guatemala, England, Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, amongst others. We have also received many thanks, congratulations, and comments, questions. All of them are very interesting. We are going to select some of them so that we can answer. The following will be the methodology to be followed. I'm going to read the questions and I will give you the floor in the same order that you participated so that you can select some of them. You don't have to respond to all of them, and you can give the response to the question that you deem better. Someone made a comment. Yesterday, the US issued a resolution requesting the International Court of Justice the issuance of a consultative opinion regarding the obligations of the states regarding climate change. What effects will it have, or could this resolution have? What international agreements and national agreements that are complementary are needed for the decision-making process regarding mitigation and adaptation for climate change in a timely and efficient manner? There is another question regarding technology. Why is research not prioritized enough for the application of the native people's knowledge in harmony with their knowledge of Mother Earth? Is that because of an epistemic injustice or a rejection to abandon the current consumption-based system or interest of a specific companies? What are the research lines that you consider to be a priority to be developed in Latin America, especially in Andean countries? In this case as well, thinking of the report that was delivered by Stella. What indicators need to be developed? What needs do you have and how can we participate? There are other questions that have to do with the problems of removing the lands from the farmers, evicting them from their lands, and if that includes policies on climate change. So we will address these questions now, and you will have the floor in the same order in which you participated. Go ahead, please. Well, I think that I will address the questions that are more related to research. And the first question should be addressed by Anne, because I think that that question is for her. So regarding the research lines that we still need in the region, well, we need many things. And I'm going to talk about two new things that we will do, and this will be done this year. One of them are the scoping reviews to really identify the gaps of information in terms of impact, adaptation measures, economy, and public policies. So we are going to have 5, and also that's going to be published in the Lancet magazine, in the journal, this session. I don't know how to call it. 5 researches or papers, 5 papers that will be released together to know what is missing in the region. But something very small from what we know that we need in research. Well, we know definitely it's research with indigenous communities and how they have to adapt to climate change. There is not a lot in the region on that regard. I would dare saying that there is nothing about it. Another topic that is still missing in the region is what is going to happen with the Amazon region if we continue deforesting, and what will happen with the function that, or the role that it plays as a carbon sink. We do not know what will happen. Well, we more or less know what will happen in terms of weather, but not in terms of health. The same thing goes for the glaciers. We are not very clear about what will happen with marine productivity and the impact that it will have on food security, especially of the countries that depend most on fish and that are related to that, like Peru. And we do not know much about what will happen with weather-related migration. I think that Anne also talked about this, but this is one of the most important topics that we need to face, and we do not have a lot of information on that regard. And I think that you mentioned issues for the Andean region, and I believe that specifically we need to work on water, and we should work with the legacy systems or the native people systems, because if we think of erosion, we are not doing good work to manage the resources, and we also need to work on energy transition in the countries. And that is a date that is data that they did not mention in the presentation, but 23% of the population, rural population in South America, they still use fossil fuels to cook. I'm talking about biomass and others. So here there is an important topic of environmental justice that we're not considering. So the countries that have more people who still use this biomass like manure is Paraguay and Peru, and I think that Bolivia as well. I'm sorry, I do not know all of this data by heart, but from these countries, the most vulnerable populations and the most isolated populations are the most exposed. What I see now is that, well, you have that Peru has the worst contamination of pollution, yes, but also within the households, especially in these populations. We are talking about ranges that reach up to 170 micrograms per cubic meter of particulated matter, and that's the one that generates problems in the lungs. So there are a lot of issues of social and environmental justice that with the research we were able to reach a certain level and to know, to give, to communicate, but actually it's the decision makers and the civil society, you as a Ministry of Health, you really have to push towards having these changes that will bring more equality. Now, regarding the indicators, Berta, that I think that's what you mentioned before, one that we are going to prioritize for next year, well, these are two things. One is that the report next year will address everything that has to do with Central America and Mexico. And secondly, within the indicators that we will be working with are the systems of resilient health. We really want to know what the healthcare systems of the regions are, how they're doing. Do they have internet? They have water? They have sewage? They have physicians or enough skills? We want to know everything, whether physicians have been trained in climate change, the nurses, etc. So one of the most important indicators that we want to work with, and it will be grouped to work with WHO and PAHO as well, because those are country indicators that we need. And another thing that is very interesting, and we do not know how to do it, is mental health. This is a very complex indicator, but also very important. Right now in the global report, there is one that speaks of the feeling of people facing extreme event like heat or whatever, but there is no mental health indicator, and that is because the data is very bad globally and here as well. Another one of the indicators that we want to work with are the costs related to dengue fever, for instance, that is the economy part. And those who want to work on public policies, we want to know what are those public policies doing to promote cleaner energies. So we want to work with that. You can see this is a totally different issue that is different from what we do in public health. Here we are talking about rights, we are talking about the legislations of the country, understanding them, analyzing them correctly. So that's why when I said that when we talk about climate change, it is huge. So this is the indicators that we want to address for next year. And of course, we want to expand this to other countries to have more coverage because Central America has been lagging behind. There is a new center for the islands and the Caribbean, but Central America is not there yet, so we are going to incorporate it. I don't know if I was able to answer the questions, Berta, because there were a lot of questions. Well, yes, excellent answers.
Respaldo desde el Organismo Andino de Salud, querida
You can
Esther.
count on our support from the Andean Health Organization. Anna, you now have the floor. Thank you, Bertha. Thank you, Stella. Yes, I agree with what Stella mentioned in terms of priorities and research. And something that attracts my attention is the issue of mental health and the issue of migrations. Because of disasters, I see this as two important areas to be addressed in the next years in terms of the research. And also for the adaptation plans of climate change, well, that's not that common in cities, unfortunately. So that is also something very important. And of course, it has to integrate health. And for us, it's obvious because we work with that every day, but it's not that obvious for the governments. And now, regarding the resolution of the UN, I'm going to talk more about that, but I think that Jessica can contribute more with that because she works precisely with these issues that are linked to the public policies. As I was saying in my presentation before, I see this as a step forward, and more importantly, the recognition of the responsibility of the countries that pollute and contaminate. And that is something good. Now, I do question how, or I do challenge how is that going to work because yes, it's nice, but how are they going to enforce it? How are they going to monitor it? Okay, yes, the International Court of Justice will be the leverage, but what will happen next? And this, how are the states going to respect that? So, well, I'm not a lawyer, so I do not know how to respond to this. to these points, but I think that there are many questions here that we have to think about. Now, regarding technology, that is always something important because when we think of technology and the loss of control of that technology and the disasters that could be generated mainly in the regions of the Amazon or the contribution that they could have, well, I think that, well, I don't know if we should bring this more natural or native people's technologies. Well, yeah, I do think that it is important and essential, but we have to think of the scale. And of course, all of that has a political dimension that is larger than us, but of course, we have to consider it. And then you also, or someone asked about the struggles of the farming communities. Yes, of course, that is very important to achieve climate justice and social justice mainly in Latin America because it's always been a very serious issue. But what I would like to emphasize here is that from the perspective of climate justice, not only the issue of mobilization, but also the issue of using soil. And that is something that we are going to see increasingly, all of these issues regarding conflicts related to climate change. There is already an increase in conflicts, sometimes because of temperature. If it's hot, there will be more conflicts, but we also see that in cities when prioritizing an area for popular lodging or an area for companies. Well, these things are going to be more present than in rural areas as well. So it's important to pay attention to that and to think about this issue because, of course, the impact is very large. And then for the rest, I would like to give the floor to Jessica because she has a lot to contribute with as well. Yes, thank you very much for your answer, Anne. And Jessica, we have received another question for you, and it has to do with how can civil society participate in this proposal that is being prepared for a resolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll start with the last question first because we haven't had a chance to cover it yet. But I think, thanks to Milena, I think colleagues at Orozcoño, I think are maybe already aware of the process, and if not, I can share the documents. But we would really welcome any additional support from other civil society organizations to show the importance of the actions that are included in the concept note of the resolution. But then also to take the actions that are included in the concept note that has been developed, and to discuss these with your government to understand which are really important at national level, the ones that need to be included in the global resolution. Because a lot of the time it's important for countries outside of South America to agree to a certain thing for it to benefit the populations and the countries of Latin America. So yes, absolutely, we would love to collaborate, and I will make sure that we share the details with colleagues in case anyone wants to reach out, and I'm happy for my email address to be shared as well if anyone would like to connect. But yeah, those are the two steps: the support of the recommendations, to add your logos to the list that was shown at the start of my presentation, and then also to discuss the contents with your government, and to add anything that you think has been missed would also be wonderful. I don't have much to add to the answers to the previous questions, only to say that I think in many circumstances the technologies and the solutions that we see from marginalized populations, from populations that are excluded, often indigenous peoples, but not exclusively. Indigenous peoples, for example, have for centuries learned how to live in harmony with the planet that we inhabit, and more those are the lessons that we have to learn again. So I think there are technologies to be implemented, but also a systemic change in the way that we think and the way we interact with the world around us. For indicators, I think the indicators that would really be valuable from what we see at the level of the World Health Assembly and the level of the UN climate negotiations are, first of all, data that enables us to to understand the extent of the health impacts of climate change. We can track deaths from malaria or incidents of malaria, but it's really hard to pinpoint how many of those cases of malaria are due to climate change rather than would have been pre-existing. So there's two separate lots of science, one to monitor the malaria cases and one to understand how much of it is due to climate change. And then also to be quantifying the health co-benefits of climate action, to say that this reduction in air pollution will save this many lives and therefore save this many dollars, or whichever currency of the country that is considering it. There are some tools, especially for mitigation co-benefits, that the World Health Assembly has developed. One of them is the Carbon H tool that was developed in Europe, and then there is also one for transport and health benefits of mitigation in the transport sector and transitioning to walking and cycling, for example, rather than private cars. I very sadly don't have too many insights into the resolution about the International Court of Justice. I know that there is still a lot to be defined, but it will be a really powerful tool for if there is a case to be made against a government that is emitting very, very high amounts by a different government that has been experienced by a different country that has been experiencing the worst climate impacts, then it will help to open the channels to make that possible and help to make, I think, hopefully, higher emitting governments, higher emitting countries, my apologies, to be incentivized to mitigate their own emissions.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Excelente reflexión.
Dear Jessica, excellent reflection. Regarding one of the questions that emphasize the need of integrating the native peoples and the native peoples' knowledge, the First Nations knowledge, we have to reiterate that there are some advances or progress that has been made in our health network and also in the network of climate, health, and environment, which is a Latin American network that places a lot of emphasis on the need of having multidisciplinary research. And different from the interdisciplinary, they also suggest the challenge of integrating the most affected populations as protagonists. And I would like to tell you that there are possibilities to support projects by the Inter-American Institute for the Research of Global Change, and also the World Consortium of Education regarding climate and health, amongst other organizations. We would like to thank all of you for your questions. We were not able to answer to all of them. However, we will take them into account to define the topics for the next webinars. We value your participation and interest. To close this Q&A session, I would like to ask each one of our speakers to give us a take-home message in only 1 minute, if possible. Thank you very much. I believe that my only message would be the one that I already mentioned. There is a long way to go in the region, but we do know that climate change is damaging the health of people. We already know that we need to improve preparedness to address this impact. So we need to continue having the zero emissions, and definitely the countries need financial commitments that are born out of our own commitments first to respond to climate change challenges. So I think that the reflection that I gave is important, and then the 4 key messages, and I think that they resonate for the entire region and for all. Thank you very much. And go ahead. What a big responsibility. Now, thinking of mental health, and well, we speak a lot about that, and well, I'm a mother. I have a 12-year-old boy, and we should also think of future generations and how they feel so much anxiety when they think of climate issues, because when we talk, we always talk about the things that are not going well, but there are also good things that are happening, and there are many people that are highly competent working on these issues. And of course, the challenges are big, the issue of governance and political issues, but we should also mention that there is competence, there is skill. Young people are so skilled and they have the capacity to continue with what we started to do, and good luck with that. Thank you very much, Jessica. You have the floor now.
Thank you so much. I think my take-home message would be on the importance of collaboration and dialogue across different sectors and different areas of expertise. We know that there is incredibly rich understanding in the health sector, and we know that there is incredibly rich understanding in the climate sector, or the transport sector, the energy sector, the food sector, but we don't do a good enough job of talking to each other. We know that there are not enough finances in the world for being allocated to climate, and there is not enough finance being allocated to health. But if the health community and the health sector can talk to the climate community and the climate sector, then maybe we can make that money go further. Maybe we can maximize the returns on investment. That's my message. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We would like to reiterate the thanks to the excellent presentations for today. We have received many congratulations on our social media. Thank you very much, Stella Hardinger, Ana Doretti, Jessica. Thanks to all the participants.
Organismo Andino de Salud y a todas las
The
personas
Andean Health Organization team and everyone who has participated in this activity that was possible due to the commitment with the Andean integration and Latin America integration. Now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Maria del Carmen Calle Davila to close this webinar on behalf of the Andean Health Organization Hipólito Unanue Agreement. Well, my first words are to deeply thank Stella and Jess, because they have mentioned in a very friendly way the things that are happening. Because sometimes when we just base on evidence, sometimes just things are complicated to communicate them. However, the three of you have been extremely clear and direct and straightforward. And definitely, we have climate change and health as a priority. We started considering it a priority even before I became part of this organization. I was already interested in this. We started in 2019 in Cusco, then we participated in the COP and in Glasgow.
Del Organismo Andino de Salud.
We have done many things at the Andean Health Organization, but there is one thing that is true, and that is that this topic has not gained the position that it deserves in the decision makers, and mainly in the ministries of economy. Because if we say that a policy or something has a strong position, it's because there is a budget for it, but we still do not have those budgets. That is the truth. We have regulations, certain progress has been made. We cannot say that there has been no progress, of course, but definitely we still need a long way to go. We still have a long way to go. I believe in evidence, and the indicators are telling us that enough is enough. And we cannot say that these are indicators outside of South America. No, these are our own indicators. And it states clearly that climate change is having a negative impact
Y ha sido muy clara la exposición
in the health of people. And Stella's presentation was very clear with the indicators, and when she talked about the extremes and children under the age of 1 and the elderly citizens. And when Anne did the storytelling, she really said, who are the populations who are mostly affected? And we know very well that it's always like that.
con mayor vulnerabilidad, hay lo que
The
se llama
populations with a higher vulnerability, well, we have this intersectionality, which means that they are poor, they belong to ethnicity,
discapacidad, si viven aquí, que no sé qué,
or
que
are
no sé
women, or they have a disability, or if they live there or that, and everything adds together. And now climate change is something that is cross-cutting.
Tampoco que haya gente que crea que no. No
I'm
hay
upset because there are some people who do not believe so. Some people overtly say, this is not true. We know that. You know that as well. A lot of people are like that. But a lot more people believe that we can do something. Now, Jess, she has been so clear when she talked about everything that is being done. At the beginning, precisely, I talked about the Justice Court, the International Court of Justice, and how they are going to sanction countries. Because let's be honest, we already know what are the countries that influence climate change more. This is like a deja vu. Every time that we get together, we more or less know things. And we're moving forward, maybe not as quickly as we wanted to, but we are indeed moving forward. 3 or 4 years ago, I used to tell Stella, and where are the mental health indicators? Because I was worried because of mental health. And right now, mental health is a worldwide emergency. The numbers are catastrophic. So we do need to look for a way to measure this. But also, something that is true was discussed, and that is that we cannot collect all of the information from everyone because our information systems are very different and the development of those systems is different. But that is also related to decision making. That is also a political decision. If a governor or president or minister is interested in certain indicators, then they will achieve that. I think that that is an issue that we need to take into account as well. The Andean Health Organization is convinced by that. We are working extensively on that, and we would like to thank you so much for your time. We know very well that we will continue working. I have heard Estella already, so Bertha, let's try to see how we can help. And I think that I'll take her to the Congress of Pediatricians in September so that pediatricians will listen to this. Because what happens if we're more people who listen and we do this hours, then there will be more possibilities to have an influence on decision making. And it just is something that is magical. The very young children and those who are older than 65. I'm a pediatrician, so I can talk to other pediatricians. I am the secretary of the social pediatrician unit at the National Society of Pediatricians, and I'm the representative of Peru in the Latin American Society of Pediatrics, and one of the issues that we are working with is climate change. And now that we have indicators, because you know how physicians are, if you don't give them indicators, they will not listen to you. However, we cannot set aside that regardless of where, in what part of the scenario you're in, we need to continue pushing this forward. And that's why, Jess, we would like to participate. We would like for you to tell us about this resolution. When will it be done? Whether we can participate as a stakeholder. And also, Anne, we would like to have a possibility to talk, to collect stories from different countries. Because let's be honest, the decision makers and those who decide where the money goes, and I'm very practical, I'm being recorded, so, well, it doesn't matter. But for those who decide where the money goes, it is very important to show a human face to those situations. So sometimes, when do they notice that things are happening? When there is a story of a specific person who's suffering from all of these struggles. Once again, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Next Thursday, we won't have a webinar because it is Easter, but on the 13th, we will meet again. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you.